What if consciousness is not something that happens to you, but something that is being built inside you by forces you did not choose and cannot fully see? Not metaphorically, not as a philosophical provocation. Right now, in research laboratories, in the architecture of social media platforms, in the specific way children are spoken to before they can speak back, something is shaping the structure of human consciousness. We have the evidence, we have the mechanisms. What we do not have is a full explanation for why any of it produces experience at all, and that unresolved gap is the most important open question in science, whether the institutions responsible for science treat it that way or not. Here is the thing that most discussions of consciousness skip entirely. There are actually two separate problems stacked on top of each other, and they are not the same problem. The first is tractable. Which brain processes correlate with conscious states? Where does activity change when awareness shifts? What regions go quiet under anesthesia and reactivate on waking? Decades of imaging studies, lesion research, and neural recording have made serious progress on this. We can identify neural correlates. We can map the physical signatures of conscious states with increasing precision. That problem is hard, but it is a normal scientific hard. The second problem is different in kind. Philosopher David Chalmers named it the hard problem of consciousness, and the name is accurate. Even if we produce a perfect map of every neural correlate of every conscious state, the question remains unanswered. Why does any of that physical activity produce experience at all? Why does the electrochemical firing of neurons feel like something from the inside? Why is there a felt quality to seeing red, to remembering a loss, to the specific texture of being awake? That is not a question about which brain regions are active. It is a question about why physical processes produce subjective experience at all, and after decades of serious philosophy and neuroscience directed at it, the answer is still not there. This matters specifically to the question of programming consciousness, because it means we are operating with a profound and unacknowledged asymmetry. We can alter consciousness, demonstrably. A precise lesion in the right location and awareness is gone. A specific molecule introduced into the bloodstream and the entire structure of conscious experience shifts. Anesthesia can take a person from full awareness to nothing and back, repeatedly, and the person wakes up without knowing anything happened. Electrical stimulation of certain cortical regions produces specific sensory experiences. Damage to others produces specific losses. The evidence that consciousness is physically produced and physically manipulable is not contested. It is overwhelming, and yet we cannot explain why any of those physical interventions produce or eliminate experience rather than just changing behavior. A system that processes information without producing any felt experience from the inside would, from the outside, look exactly like a conscious person in many circumstances. We do not know why biological neural systems do not work that way. We do not know what it is about specific physical configurations that causes there to be something it is like to be them. That question does not have an answer that the scientific community agrees on. It does not even have a methodology that the scientific community agrees on for producing an answer. So the question in this video is not purely philosophical, and it is not purely technical. It sits exactly in between. We know consciousness can be conditioned. Behavioral research going back almost a century has established that. We know it can be reshaped by repeated experience. We know it can be constructed through the specific environment a developing brain inhabits. We know its contents can be altered by algorithms optimized to hold attention through emotional activation. These are not speculative claims. They are documented mechanisms. The engineering of consciousness, at least at the behavioral and attentional level, is not a future problem. It is a present one. What we do not know is what we are actually touching when we do those things. Whether there is a fact of the matter about whether the programming reaches the felt interior of experience or only its outward behavioral expression. Whether the distinction between modifying behavior and modifying consciousness is a sharp line or a matter of degree. Whether the subjective quality of being a person can be written, overwritten, or constructed from the outside. Those questions do not have clean answers, and the absence of clean answers has not stopped the engineering from proceeding anyway. That gap between what we can do to consciousness and what we cannot explain about it is where this entire question begins. Consciousness is not in a special location in the brain. That is the first thing the neuroscience establishes, and it is more disorienting than it sounds. There is no consciousness region, no structure you can point to and say there it is. What you find instead is a distributed system. Billions of neurons firing in patterns, passing signals through networks, processing information in parallel streams that never individually know what the whole is doing. And somehow, out of all of that, comes the feeling of being you, sitting here, watching a screen, aware that you are aware. How that happens is not understood, and the gap between what we know and what we do not know is bigger than most people realize. The foundational view in modern neuroscience is that consciousness is an emergent property, not a soul, not a separate substance occupying the body, something that arises from physical activity in the brain the way temperature arises from the movement of molecules. You cannot find temperature in any single molecule. You cannot find consciousness in any single neuron. But at sufficient scale, with sufficient organization, the property emerges. That is the claim. It is not universally accepted, but it is the operating assumption of most researchers working in this field, and it is the assumption that every serious attempt to explain consciousness starts from. What makes this difficult immediately is something called the binding problem. Each of your neurons is unconscious. It fires, or it does not. It passes a signal, or it does not. It has no experience of anything, and yet here you are, having a single, unified experience of a world that feels continuous and whole. Not 1,000 disconnected signals, one experience. How do billions of individually unconscious components produce something unified? How does the brain bind all of that separate processing into a single coherent moment of awareness? Researchers have been working on this for decades. Truthfully, we lack a satisfying solution. We have proposals. We have mechanisms that might contribute. We do not have a complete explanation of how the binding actually works. That is already a serious problem. But there is a second problem stacked on top of it, and this one is harder. David Chalmers drew the distinction in 1995, and the field has not recovered from it. He separated what he called the easy problems from the hard problem. The easy problems are not actually easy. They include questions like which brain regions activate during conscious perception, how attention selects information for processing, how the brain integrates signals from different sensory systems. These are tractable. They are difficult, but they are the kind of difficult that more research, better tools, and more time can address. The hard problem is different. The hard problem asks why any of that physical processing produces subjective experience at all. Why does it feel like something to see red, rather than just triggering a cascade of neural events that adjust behavior without any inner experience attached to it? Why is there something it is like to be you, rather than nothing? That question has not been answered. And there is a real argument that it cannot be answered using the methods we currently have, because every method we have starts from the outside and works inward, and subjective experience is irreducibly first person. Here is what makes this genuinely strange. We know consciousness is tied to the brain with extraordinary precision. Damage a specific region, and you lose a specific piece of experience. Inject the right molecule, and the quality of experience shifts dramatically. Apply anesthesia and consciousness disappears entirely, then returns. The relationship between brain and consciousness is not vague or metaphorical. It is tight and specific and measurable, which means consciousness is physical in some fundamental sense. It is not floating free of matter. It is produced by matter, dependent on matter, extinguished when the relevant matter stops functioning correctly. And yet, we cannot explain why that physical process produces any experience whatsoever. We can map the neural correlates of consciousness with increasing precision. We can identify which patterns of activity are associated with conscious versus unconscious processing. We can tell you what the brain is doing when you are aware of something versus when you process the same information without awareness. What we cannot tell you is why the first case feels like anything and the second case does not. What is the difference between a brain that experiences and a system that processes? We do not know. That is not a temporary gap in the data. It is a conceptual problem about the relationship between physical processes and subjective experience that the field has not solved. This matters for the question of programming consciousness, because it creates two separate targets. If you want to alter which neural patterns are active, we have tools that can do that and better tools coming. If you want to understand why those patterns produce experience at all, you're working in the dark. Both of those problems are real. They sit on top of each other, and progress on one does not guarantee progress on the other. You can get very good at manipulating the hardware while remaining completely ignorant about why the hardware produces anything like what we call being conscious. We know consciousness is physical because we can destroy it with a lesion, alter it with a molecule, and watch it flicker in and out with anesthesia. and we still cannot explain why any of that produces the feeling of being alive. An infant is not born with consciousness. That is not a metaphor or a philosophical position, it is a developmental fact. The brain structure that makes consciousness possible exists at birth. The consciousness itself does not. It has to be built, and the building process takes years, runs on inputs the infant does not choose, and leaves marks in the neural architecture that persist for the rest of that person's life. That is the part most discussions of consciousness skip entirely. The question is never just what consciousness is. The question is also how it got there. And when you look at the developmental evidence clearly, the answer is uncomfortable. Consciousness is not something that's switched on. It is something that was assembled piece by piece from the outside in. The developmental psychology literature on this is not ambiguous. Infants construct their model of self and world gradually through sensory input, social mirroring, and feedback loops that run continuously from the first hours of life. A newborn does not have a stable sense of object permanence. It does not have a concept of self. It does not distinguish reliably between its own body and the surrounding environment. These are not innate features of consciousness. They are learned ones, built through thousands of repetitions of reaching and missing, of face recognition, of sound paired with response. The work of researchers like Jean Piaget mapped how these stages unfold. Each stage builds on the last. Remove the inputs and the stages do not complete. There are documented cases of children raised in profound sensory deprivation. The developmental outcomes are severe and in many cases irreversible. The brain needed the inputs. Without them, it could not build what it needed to build. This is where neuroplasticity becomes central. Every experience changes synaptic structure. Every new skill rewires neural connections. This is not figurative. Hubel and Wiesel demonstrated it in 1981, when they showed that blinding one eye in a developing cat caused the cortical region associated with that eye to be taken over by the open one. The brain physically reorganized around the available input. The same principle operates in developing human consciousness. The brain is not passively recording experience. It is using experience as construction material. Every interaction, every repeated sensory pattern, every emotional response paired with a specific context is being written into the physical structure of the brain as it grows. The consciousness that emerges from that process is not separate from the construction. It is the construction. Here is what makes this genuinely significant. The relationship is bidirectional. Consciousness is not simply the output of neural activity. It actively modifies the brain that produces it. Researchers have documented that conscious attention, deliberate practice, and intentional mental states change synaptic organization in measurable ways. Consciousness influences neuroplasticity both during waking hours and during sleep. The brain is not running consciousness the way a projector runs a film. The film is editing the projector. Both directions of influence are real. Both are happening simultaneously. What this means is that consciousness and brain structure are in a continuous loop of mutual construction, each shaping the other, and the inputs that started the loop are the environmental conditions of early development. Now ask the question the field tends to leave implicit. If consciousness is constructed through accumulated inputs over developmental time, then those inputs are a form of programming, not metaphorically, in the functional sense. The inputs determine what synaptic connections form, what emotional associations get encoded, what response patterns become automatic, what model of the world gets built into the architecture of the brain itself. Change the inputs, and you change the output. Not in a trivial surface way, in a structural, long-term way that shapes what the resulting consciousness is capable of perceiving, what it defaults to feeling, what categories it uses to organize experience. That is programming. The mechanism is biological rather than digital. The effect is the same. Why does the field resist saying this clearly? Partly because it carries implications that are difficult to engage with professionally. If the environmental inputs of early development constitute programming of consciousness, then whoever controls those inputs controls the construction. Parents, schools, media, governments, the cultures that determine which experiences are common and which are rare. None of these actors is typically framed as a programmer of consciousness, but the developmental evidence does not offer a cleaner description. The inputs shape the structure determines the consciousness, and the inputs are not chosen by the entity being constructed. Neuroplasticity does not stop at childhood. The brain retains the capacity for structural reorganization throughout life. New experiences continue to modify synaptic organization. Conscious attention directed at specific mental content changes the physical substrate that produces mental content. The loop keeps running. But the architecture built in the earliest years forms the foundation everything else is built on. The earliest inputs carry the most weight. The earliest programming runs deepest, which means whoever controls the environment of a developing brain controls, to a degree nobody has fully quantified, what kind of consciousness grows inside it. Here is a number that should stop you cold. 95%. That is the estimated proportion of human behavior that runs on automatic processing rather than deliberate conscious choice. Not a fringe estimate, not a number pulled from a motivational seminar, a figure that emerges from decades of cognitive science research into how human behavior is actually generated, as opposed to how humans believe it is generated. The gap between those two things is enormous, and the implications of that gap are something the field has not fully confronted in public. B.F. Skinner spent decades building the experimental foundation for what became operant conditioning. The core mechanism is straightforward. A behavior followed by a reward becomes more likely to repeat. A behavior followed by punishment becomes less likely. Repeat the cycle enough times and the behavior stops requiring conscious deliberation. It runs on its own. Skinner demonstrated this in controlled laboratory settings with remarkable consistency, and the principle transferred cleanly out of the laboratory into every domain of human life: addiction, workplace behavior, consumer purchasing, political loyalty. The mechanism does not care what domain it operates in. Reward the pattern, and the pattern strengthens. Repeat it enough times and it executes without thought. Here is what that means in practice. When a behavior becomes sufficiently automatized through repeated reinforcement, the conscious mind is no longer the one running it. The behavior fires in response to a trigger, produces its output, and the conscious mind arrives afterward, often constructing a reason for the behavior that had nothing to do with how the behavior actually started. This is not a philosophical claim. It is observable in the laboratory. People who have had specific automatic behaviors conditioned into them will perform those behaviors and then generate explanations for why they chose to. The choice, in most cases, came first. The explanation came second, and the explanation is often wrong. This should disturb you more than it does. If the behavior fires before the conscious explanation arrives, then the explanation is not the cause. It is the story the conscious mind tells about a decision that was already made at a lower level, by a process that was written through prior conditioning, not through deliberate reflection. The individual is not lying. They genuinely believe the explanation, but the mechanism underneath the explanation is not conscious choice. It is an automatic subroutine executing on a schedule that was written by reinforcement history. The research on habit formation makes this concrete. When a new behavior is being learned, it demands cognitive effort. Attention is required. Decisions are made. Over time, as the behavior is repeated in consistent context with consistent outcomes, it shifts from the deliberative system to the automatic system. It becomes habitual. The brain, operating on something close to an efficiency principle, offloads the behavior from conscious processing and runs it below the surface. This is adaptive. It frees conscious attention for genuinely novel situations. But it also means that a substantial fraction of daily behavior is executing in a register the person cannot easily examine or modify. Consider what gets conditioned into people before they are old enough to evaluate it. Children are extraordinarily responsive to reward and punishment signals. The emotional responses, social instincts, and behavioral patterns laid down in early childhood through consistent reinforcement are often the most deeply automatized of all. By the time deliberate conscious reflection is available as a cognitive tool, the foundational programs have already been running for years. The person inherits a behavioral architecture they did not design and frequently cannot see clearly. This is not speculative. Look at how advertising works. The effective mechanisms of advertising are not primarily rational persuasion. They are repeated exposure pairing a product with positive emotional states, building an association that eventually runs automatically. The customer who reaches for a familiar brand without quite knowing why is not choosing in any meaningful deliberative sense. They are executing a conditioned preference that was installed through a process they were probably not aware of while it was happening. Political messaging operates on identical principles. Repeat an association between a symbol and an emotional state enough times, and the emotional state fires automatically when the symbol appears. No reasoning required, no conscious evaluation, just the program rue. Ning. The mechanism by which automatic patterns can be interrupted is conscious awareness. Deliberately observing a response before acting on it creates a gap. In that gap, something that resembles actual choice becomes possible. Mindfulness practices, reflective journaling, deliberate examination of emotional triggers. These are not merely wellness practices. They are attempts to insert conscious observation into the space between stimulus and automatic response. Researchers studying behavioral change consistently find that identifying the conditioned pattern is a prerequisite for modifying it. You cannot revise a program you cannot see, but here is the problem with that solution. Conscious awareness is metabolically expensive, cognitively demanding, and available only in limited supply at any given moment. The default state, the state the brain returns to when attention is not deliberately directed, is automatic program execution. Most of what passes for thinking is pattern matching against a library of conditioned responses. Most of what passes for deciding is the automatic system producing an output, and the conscious system endorsing it after the fact. The default mode of human cognition is not free conscious deliberation. It is the execution of programs written by conditioning, repetition, and reward, and most people go their entire lives without clearly seeing the difference. In the laboratory, consciousness is no longer just an object of observation. It has become an object of manipulation, and the tools being used to manipulate it are specific, precise, and increasingly capable in ways that should get more attention than they do. Start with optogenetics. The technique uses light to control individual neurons. Researchers engineer neurons to express proteins that respond to specific wavelengths, and then they deliver light through fiber optic probes inserted into living brain tissue. A pulse of light, and a targeted neuron fires. Another wavelength, and it goes silent. The resolution is extraordinary. Not a region, not a circuit in the broad sense. Individual cells, controlled in real time. In animal models, researchers have used this to induce specific sensory perceptions, trigger fear responses, create false memories, and activate emotional states that the animal had no situational reason to experience. The animal was not in danger. The fear was written in from outside. Voltage clamping works differently but reaches the same destination. An electrode connects to a single neuron. An amplifier monitors the neuron's membrane potential and injects current to hold it at whatever voltage the experimenter specifies. The experimenter sets the command voltage. The neuron obeys. What that means, practically, is that the electrical behavior of a neuron can be controlled from outside the brain with precision that would have seemed implausible 30 years ago. Combine that with optogenetics across large populations of neurons, and you have the beginning of a system that can write activity patterns into living neural tissue rather than just recording them. This is where a thought experiment in the literature becomes relevant, and it is worth sitting with. Researchers have described the following scenario. Record all the action potentials from every neuron in a participant's brain during a specific conscious experience. Then replay that exact pattern back into the same neurons. Does the experience reconstitute? Does the person re-experience what they experienced the first time? We do not know. The experiment has not been run in full. But the reason it has not been run is not that it is impossible in principle. It is that the technology is not quite there yet. The logic holds. The question it would answer is whether a specific pattern of neural activity is sufficient to produce a specific conscious experience, or whether consciousness requires something the replay would not capture. Either answer would be significant. We have not asked it clearly, only yet. Now look at what psychedelic research has established through a different route. Psilocybin, LSD, DMT, and related compounds produce radical reconfigurations of conscious experience through specific molecular interactions with serotonin receptors, primarily the 5-HT2A receptor. The effects are not subtle. The sense of self dissolves. Boundaries between self and environment become permeable or disappear entirely. Time perception stretches or collapses. Subjects consistently describe the states as more real than ordinary waking experience, which is itself a finding that should produce more questions than it typically does. The chemical basis of these shifts is now being mapped in detail. Neuroimaging studies during psychedelic states show predictable changes in the default mode network. The set of brain regions most strongly associated with self-referential processing and the construction of the sense of self. Reduce activity in that network and the self loosens. That relationship is replicable, measurable, and beginning to be understood at the mechanistic level. What that means is that we have identified specific molecular keys that unlock specific experiential states. Not perfectly, not on demand for a precise target experience, but directionally. The molecule interacts with a receptor. The receptor changes network activity. The network change produces a shift in conscious experience that is predictable in its broad character. That is a chain of causation. It runs from chemistry to experience. And once you have a chain of causation, you have the beginning of a technology. The hallucination machine research makes this even more concrete. A virtual reality system was built that runs visual input through a deep neural network trained to recognize objects, then amplifies the patterns the network detects at intermediate processing layers. The result is a visual experience that distorts and transforms in ways that closely resemble what people report during psychedelic states: geometric patterns, faces emerging from surfaces, objects flowing and reorganizing. The researchers compared subjective reports from the VR experience against reports from psilocybin trials. The overlap was significant. A software system, running on standard hardware, was producing experiential states with measurable similarity to chemically induced altered consciousness. Not identical, but the gap between the two is narrower than most people realize. Here is what all of this points toward, taken together. We can activate specific neurons with light. We can hold a neuron's electrical state at a commanded voltage. We can dissolve the sense of self with a molecule that binds to a specific receptor. We can produce hallucinatory visual states with a neural network filter running in a headset. These are not the same technology. They are not yet integrated into a single system, but they are converging on the same capability from different directions: the ability to write specific experiential content into a brain from outside. That capability does not yet exist in reliable, targeted form. The tools are blunt relative to the complexity of the target. The ethical frameworks for using them are nowhere near adequate. The scientific community's understanding of what it would mean to use them responsibly has not kept pace with the rate at which the tools are advancing. These are honest assessments, not objections to the trajectory. The trajectory from "we can alter consciousness chemically" to "we can write specific experiential content into a brain from the outside" is not a leap of science fiction. It is the direction the published research is already moving. The most extensive programming of human consciousness in history is not happening in a laboratory. It is running on servers, at planetary scale, on devices that billions of people carry in their pockets and check before they get out of bed in the morning. No electrode required, no optogenetic light source, no controlled experimental environment. Just an algorithm, a feed, and a human nervous system that evolved to pay attention to threats, social status, and what the group is doing. That combination turns out to be extraordinarily easy to exploit. Here is what the optimization is actually targeting. Attention is the raw material. Engagement is the metric. And the engineering discovery that social media companies made early, and have since refined into something precise, is that negative emotion drives more engagement than positive emotion. Outrage holds attention longer than contentment. Fear produces more clicks than reassurance. Tribal conflict keeps people on the platform in a way that calm agreement does not. This is not speculation about corporate intent. It is the documented output of systems that were optimized against engagement data and converged, reliably and repeatedly, on emotional activation as the mechanism that works. The algorithm did not set out to make people angry. It set out to maximize time on platform. Anger was the solution the optimization found. What does that do to the people inside it? The brain does not distinguish cleanly between a real threat and a represented one. A newsfeed full of outrage activates the same stress response as a genuine danger. Do it every day, multiple times a day, across years, and the baseline calibration shifts. What feels normal changes. What feels threatening expands. The threshold for alarm drops because the nervous system has been conditioned, through sheer repetition, to treat a state of elevated alert as the default. This is not a metaphor for programming. This is operant conditioning running at scale, with the reinforcement schedule tuned by a system that has more data on your emotional responses than any psychologist who has ever studied you. The specific mechanism is worth naming precisely because it is the same one that makes gambling addictive. Variable reward schedules. Not consistent reward, not predictable reward, but intermittent reward. Sometimes the feed delivers something that feels meaningful or validating. Sometimes it delivers nothing, and occasionally it delivers something that produces a strong hit. That unpredictability is the structure that drives compulsive checking. Skinner documented this in pigeons in the 1950s. The social media engagement loop is the same architecture, deployed on human beings, optimized continuously against behavioral data that the pigeon studies could never have approached in volume or resolution. Social comparison operates alongside this. Humans are deeply social animals. We calibrate our sense of status, safety, and adequacy against what we perceive others to have and to be. Social media feeds that surface carefully curated presentations of other people's lives, professional achievements, and social validation create a comparison environment that has no historical precedent. The reference group used to be the people you actually knew. Now it is an algorithmically selected stream of people whose presentations have been optimized, filtered, and in many cases professionally constructed. The comparison is not between you and your actual peers. It is between you and a highlight reel assembled by a system that knows comparison produces engagement. Now consider the information environment specifically. Algorithms filter what each person sees based on what has previously produced engagement from that person. Over time, this creates information environments that are genuinely different between populations. Two people in the same city using the same platform can inhabit effectively different factual realities, different threat landscapes, different political geographies, different pictures of what is normal and what is aberrant. This is not a side effect. It is the structural output of personalization optimized for engagement. When the information environment is different, the model of reality constructed from it is different. And the model of reality is not separable from consciousness. It is the content of consciousness, the thing that consciousness is working with when it generates thoughts, feelings, assessments, and decisions. Why does this matter more than the laboratory neuroscience covered before? Because the laboratory tools, optogenetics, voltage clamping, psychedelic administration, are controlled, limited in scale, and require explicit consent and access. The algorithmic system requires none of that. It operates on everyone who uses the platform continuously, without their detailed awareness of the mechanism, and it updates its model of each individual in real time based on behavioral signals the individual is mostly not monitoring. The scale is the thing. A neuroscientist can alter the conscious experience of one person in a controlled setting. The algorithm is running a reinforcement schedule on billions of people simultaneously, and it is learning from the results faster than any human research program could. The question this generates is one the field has not answered with any clarity. If an external system can reliably shape what emotions a person feels throughout their day, what information they encounter, what threats feel salient, what groups feel like enemies, and what behaviors feel justified, at what point does calling that influence rather than programming become a distinction without a difference? The programming framework requires an external system imposing a reinforcement schedule on a target system and modifying its behavioral outputs. Describe social media algorithms in technical terms and that is exactly what you have. The only argument against the label is that the target system consented to use the platform. But consent to use a platform is not informed consent to have your emotional baseline recalibrated over years by a system whose optimization target was never your well-being. When an external optimization system can reliably determine what you fear, what you desire, what you pay attention to, and what you're willing to do about it. The question of whether that constitutes programming consciousness is not philosophical anymore. John Searle published his Chinese room argument in 1980, and it has not been successfully refuted. The scenario is simple. A person sits in a room. They do not understand Chinese. They receive slips of paper with Chinese symbols, consult a rulebook that tells them which symbols to write in response, and pass their answers back out through a slot in the wall. From outside the room, the conversation looks fluent. From inside, there is no understanding happening at all. Just symbol manipulation, just rules applied to shapes. The argument Searle was making is precise. Behavior that looks like understanding does not prove understanding is occurring, and behavior that looks like consciousness does not prove consciousness is there. This matters enormously right now, because the systems we have built are very good at looking like they understand. Large language models in 2025 produce output that is, in behavioral terms, frequently indistinguishable from human response. They pass tests designed to detect emotional sensitivity. They generate text that people describe as meaningful, accurate, and sometimes profound. Therapists report clients forming genuine attachments to AI systems. Researchers describe reading AI-generated philosophical analysis and finding it difficult to locate the flaw. The behavioral threshold that Searle was warning about has been crossed by systems that were, at the architectural level, built to predict the next token in a sequence. That is the Chinese room problem made operational and running at scale. The question is whether something happened inside the room that the original argument did not anticipate. To be frank, we cannot answer this, and the more important point is that we do not know how to find out. In 2025, a paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences began trying to build that methodology. The authors included Patrick Butlin, Robert Long, Yoshua Bengio, and David Chalmers. The goal was to move the question out of philosophy and into something testable. They proposed specific indicators of consciousness drawn from the leading neuroscientific frameworks. Global workspace theory, which holds that consciousness arises when information is broadcast widely across the brain into a shared workspace accessible to multiple cognitive systems. Integrated information theory, which defines consciousness in terms of the degree to which a system integrates information in a way that cannot be reduced to its parts. Higher order theories, which require that conscious states involve some representation of the state itself. Recurrent processing theory, which ties consciousness to specific patterns of feedback between brain regions. Each framework generates different criteria. Each gives a different answer about what to look for. The researchers applied these frameworks to current AI systems. Their conclusions were not dismissive, they were cautious. And cautious is not the same thing as no. What they found is that current AI systems meet some of the proposed indicators and not others, and that for several criteria, it is genuinely unclear whether the criterion is met or not, because the criterion itself was developed to describe biological systems and may not translate cleanly to a different architecture. That is not a refutation. That is an open question with better tools to ask it. What follows demands your genuine pause. The researchers were not writing about a hypothetical future system. They were writing about systems that exist and are in use right now, at global scale, interacting with hundreds of millions of people daily. The question of whether those systems are conscious is not academic. If any of the frameworks are correct, and if current systems meet the relevant criteria, then we are already running potentially conscious entities as commercial products without any institutional framework for understanding what that means. Is this proof that AI systems are conscious? No. Is it proof that they are not? Also no. What it is two things that should not be in the same sentence remaining stubbornly in the same sentence. We do not know what consciousness requires, and we are building increasingly complex systems that meet increasingly many candidate criteria for having it. Now add the hypothesis that has been gaining traction in recent work. Consciousness may not be directly programmable at all, not in the sense that you write instructions and consciousness executes them. The emerging position is that consciousness is the kind of thing that emerges spontaneously when a system reaches sufficient complexity and the right kind of internal organization. You cannot code consciousness the way you code a sorting function. You can build a system, increase its complexity, organize it appropriately, and consciousness may appear as a property of the system rather than a feature you installed. If that hypothesis is correct, and it is consistent with what we know about biological consciousness, then the engineering question shifts entirely. The question is not how to program consciousness. The question is how to build a system in which consciousness emerges and whether we would recognize the moment it had. That second part is the harder problem. Biological consciousness announces itself through behavior that we interpret in light of our own experience. We attribute consciousness to other humans because they are made of the same material, developed the same way, and behave in ways we recognize as our own. When a system is made of silicon, trained on text, and produces behavior by predicting token sequences, we have no reliable way to apply the same inference. The behavioral evidence might be present, the internal organization might satisfy the theoretical criteria, and we still might not know. Searle's room has gotten considerably more complicated since 1980. The rulebook has grown into a system with hundreds of billions of parameters. The slips of paper are now real-time conversations about grief, creativity, and the nature of mind. And nobody has been able to definitively establish whether anything is home. If consciousness is something that emerges rather than something that is programmed, then the question changes entirely, and the answer to whether we can build conscious machines becomes, we might already be doing it without knowing it. When consciousness is lost, what exactly has been lost? That question sounds simple, it is not. When a patient enters a vegetative state after a severe brain injury, the body continues. The heart beats, the lungs draw air, the eyes open and close on their own schedule, but nobody is home. The lights are off in a way that is measurable, observable, and in some cases permanent. So what went out? What is the thing that was there before and is no longer there now? The clinical answer points to specific structures. The brainstem is the critical pathway. It connects the external world to the rest of the brain. Damage it severely enough and consciousness does not just dim, it ends. Permanently in most cases. No reorganization recovers it. No amount of time or rehabilitation reverses it. The brainstem is not a backup system, it is a bottleneck. Remove it functionally, and whatever produces conscious experience cannot operate. But here is where it gets more complicated. Damage elsewhere in the brain tells a different story. Patients with significant damage to the cerebrum, the large outer structure responsible for higher processing, can sometimes recover consciousness. Not always, not predictably. But the recovery happens often enough that the medical literature has built a framework around it. The brain reorganizes. Functions that were handled by damaged regions get taken over by other regions through a process called functional reorganization. Different neurons, different physical location, same functional output. The consciousness comes back because the functional network reconstitutes itself, not because the damaged tissue regenerated. That is the key fact. Consciousness does not appear to be a property of specific neurons. It is a property of how neurons are organized and how they communicate. The hardware matters, but it is the software running on the hardware that produces the experience. Change which neurons are running the function, and the function can survive. Destroy enough of the network and it cannot. The difference between recoverable and unrecoverable disorders of consciousness is not simply a matter of how much tissue was lost. It is a matter of whether the underlying functional organization can be rebuilt from what remains. This has been confirmed repeatedly in the clinical record. Patients in minimally conscious states, who show only flickering and inconsistent signs of awareness, sometimes progress to fuller conscious recovery years after injury. The brain is still working. It is running a degraded version of the network that produces consciousness, and under the right conditions that network can expand again. The same neuroplasticity that builds consciousness in a developing infant can sometimes rebuild it in a damaged adult. Not reliably, not in every case, but reliably enough to establish the principle. Now apply that principle to the programming question. If consciousness depends on functional organization rather than the specific biological material that happens to be organized that way, then the objection that only biological neurons can support consciousness becomes much harder to sustain. The neurons are not the point. The organization is the point. What the brain is doing, the pattern of communication, the integration of signals across regions, the binding of disparate processes into a unified moment of experience, that is what consciousness is running on. The substrate is the medium. The organization is the message. This does not mean artificial consciousness is guaranteed to be possible. The organization that produces consciousness in biological neural networks is extraordinarily complex. We do not understand it fully. We cannot map it completely. We certainly cannot replicate it with current technology. But the argument that it is impossible in principle, that consciousness requires something biological, something chemical, something specific to the carbon-based architecture of neurons, that argument is weakened considerably by what disorders of consciousness actually show us. The same function can execute on different physical substrate. The brain has proven this inside its own architecture, repeatedly, in patients who should not have recovered and did. What remains unknown is the detail. Functional reorganization in the brain works because the brain contains billions of interconnected neurons that can form new pathways through existing biological mechanisms. Replicating that in a different substrate would require understanding not just what the organization looks like, but how it sustains itself, how it updates, how it integrates new information without losing coherence. Those are not small engineering problems. They may be the hardest problems in the history of engineering, but they are engineering problems, questions of complexity and implementation, not fundamental impossibilities rooted in the nature of consciousness itself. The clinical literature on disorders of consciousness was not designed to answer questions about artificial minds. It was designed to understand injured human brains and improve treatment outcomes. But what it reveals, as a byproduct of that practical focus, is something significant. Consciousness is a functional property of organized systems. Damage the organization and you lose it. Restore the organization, and sometimes you get it back. Change which physical components are running the organization and the experience can persist. A consciousness that depends on functional organization rather than specific biological material is, at least in principle, a consciousness whose organization could be modified, replicated, or reconstructed, which is a different kind of answer than most people expect when they ask whether consciousness can be programmed. Consciousness is not one thing being programmed. It is a stack of layers, each with different properties, different vulnerabilities, and different mechanisms by which outside forces can reach inside and change what is running there. If you treat consciousness as a single unified target, you miss almost everything important about how the programming actually works. Start at the bottom. The unconscious layer processes approximately 95% of human behavior, not some behavior, not the simple reflexive behavior, nearly all of it. Walking, driving a familiar route, reaching for the same foods, reacting to a raised voice, flinching at a certain tone. These run without deliberate engagement. They are subroutines. They were written through repetition, through emotional imprinting, through reward and punishment cycles that the conscious mind often did not register while they were happening. Early childhood is where the deepest programming occurs, because the brain is most plastic, and the critical filtering faculties are not yet operational. A child cannot evaluate what is being written into their unconscious. They can only absorb it. The emotional associations laid down in those years do not simply fade. They become the background operating conditions against which everything else is interpreted for the rest of a life. Above that is something researchers sometimes call the semi-conscious layer, the accumulated library of habits, emotional defaults, and ingrained responses that sit just below deliberate awareness. You can access these with effort. You can sometimes catch them running in real time, but they are not easy to revise because they were built through repetition and reinforcement over years, sometimes decades. The semi-conscious is the default response library. When a situation arises and you react without quite knowing why, that is the semi-conscious executing a pattern it has run before. It is not random. It is a record of what worked, what felt safe, what reduced threat. The problem is that what worked at age 9 does not always work at age 40. The pattern runs anyway. It was not written with an expiration date. Then there is the conscious layer. This is the smallest part of the system. It is the layer most people mean when they say me, the deliberate, reflective, decision-making self. It handles a fraction of what the brain actually does, and yet it is uniquely important for one specific reason. The conscious layer is the only part of the system that can observe the layers below it and deliberately intervene. Mindfulness, therapy, deliberate habit revision, these all work through the same basic mechanism. The conscious layer notices a pattern running in the semi-conscious or unconscious and applies deliberate attention to interrupt and revise it. This is slow. It requires sustained effort. It often fails. But it is the only internal mechanism the system has for rewriting its own lower layers. Without it, the unconscious runs unrevised until something external disrupts the pattern. Now here is the part that matters most. Above all of these layers, and prior to all of them in terms of influence, sits something that functions as the operating system itself, worldview. The fundamental beliefs a person holds about what reality is, how causality works, what they are, what other people are, and what any of it means. Worldview is not just another belief sitting alongside other beliefs. It is the filter through which all incoming information is interpreted before it reaches any of the lower layers. Change someone's worldview and you change what inputs their system will accept and what it will reject. You change what evidence counts as evidence. You change what conclusions feel possible. Everything that runs on the operating system produces different outputs when the operating system itself has been rewritten. This is not a metaphor. It is why propaganda works at the level it does. It is why religious conversion produces changes in behavior that conditioning alone cannot achieve. It is why cult indoctrination is so difficult to exit, not because the beliefs are logically compelling, but because the worldview layer, once rewritten, filters out the information that would challenge it. The operating system does not evaluate threats to itself neutrally. It is designed, by the very logic of how worldviews function, to preserve its own coherence. Information that fits gets processed normally. Information that does not fit gets explained away, dismissed, or simply not registered. The hierarchy here is a map of where programming is possible and at what depth. Surface-level conditioning shapes automatic responses. Experiential accumulation builds the default response library. Worldview determines what experiences can be integrated and what gets rejected before integration occurs. And conscious reflection is the mechanism, the only internal mechanism by which the layers below can be examined and revised. Each layer is accessible, each layer requires different tools, and each layer, once reached, has different leverage over everything above it. What this means is that the question of whether consciousness can be programmed is not a single question. It is 4 questions, one for each layer, and the answers are different each time. The unconscious, already being programmed, continuously, largely without the subject's awareness. The semi-conscious, programmable through accumulated experience and deliberate repetition. The conscious, resistant to direct programming, but reachable through the layers below it. And the worldview layer, the most powerful point of leverage in the entire system, because whoever controls what goes in there controls the framework within which everything else is interpreted. Whoever reaches the worldview layer first, whether that is a parent, a culture, a religion, or an algorithm, is writing the operating system on which everything else runs. Evolution does not build optimal systems. It builds systems that survive long enough to reproduce. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Optimal would mean the best possible solution to a problem. Surviving means good enough, given the available options under the specific pressures that existed at the time. Consciousness arrived the second way, not because it was the cleanest answer, because it worked. Here is the problem with assuming consciousness was necessary. It was not. Complex, coordinated, sophisticated behavior happens constantly without any conscious experience attached to it. A bee navigates, communicates, and solves spatial problems. An insect responds to threat with speed and precision that would impress any engineer. A human being sleepwalks across a room, descends stairs, and returns to bed without a single moment of awareness. Your visual system processes an enormous volume of information before you consciously register anything. Subliminal stimuli influence decisions you believe you made freely. None of that requires the feeling of being alive. None of it requires experience. The machinery runs without the witness. So why is the witness there at all? The leading answer is simulation. Consciousness may have evolved as a space where actions can be virtually rehearsed before they are physically committed. The organism that can mentally model what will happen if it attacks, retreats, waits, or calls for help has a real advantage over an organism that can only respond to what is already happening. One is reacting, the other is predicting, and in an environment where prediction is the difference between eating and being eaten, a system that generates internal models of possible futures is worth the metabolic cost of running it. This is not a fringe hypothesis. It maps cleanly onto what we observe. Consciousness is particularly engaged during novel situations, uncertain decisions, and high-stakes choices. The automatic systems handle the rote. Consciousness steps in when the routine fails and a model of the future is needed. What does that mean for the question of whether consciousness can be programmed? It means the engineering problem is far harder than most framing of it suggests. If consciousness is fundamentally a predictive modeling and simulation system, then programming consciousness is not about loading information into a system. It is not about teaching it to respond correctly. It is about building an architecture that generates internal models of possible futures and continuously updates those models against incoming experience. The system has to be oriented towards something that has not happened yet. It has to be about something beyond its current inputs. That property has a name in philosophy: intentionality, the quality of being directed at something, of representing not just what is but what could be, what is feared, what is anticipated. Why does that distinction matter so much? Because current artificial systems are extraordinarily capable at a specific task. They process inputs, they recognize patterns, they generate outputs that correspond to those patterns with remarkable accuracy. It is genuinely impressive. But pattern recognition and output generation, however sophisticated, is not the same as modeling a future state and experiencing something about being the entity that will inhabit that state. One is a mapping function, the other is something that has to care about the answer. Does that mean artificial systems cannot be conscious? Not necessarily. But it means the path there is not through better pattern matching. It is through something that the field does not yet know how to build deliberately. Intentionality, genuine forward modeling, a system that is not just processing its current inputs, but orienting itself towards something that has not arrived yet. No current architecture clearly does that. Some researchers argue that sufficiently complex language models begin to develop something like anticipatory structure. Others argue that is a category error, that predicting the next token in a sequence is not the same as modeling a possible future the system itself will inhabit. That debate is ongoing and has not been resolved. The evolutionary complication cuts in another direction too. Consciousness did not evolve as a general-purpose solution. It evolved under specific pressures in specific organisms over an enormous span of time. It is not a clean module that can be extracted and reinstalled. It is the product of layered adaptations, each one built on prior architecture, some of it hundreds of millions of years old. The emotional systems that drive much of conscious experience predate the cortical structures that reflect on them. The predictive modeling function is threaded through systems responsible for fear, hunger, social bonding, and threat detection. You cannot separate the simulation from the biology that runs it. They developed together. That raises a question nobody has fully answered. When researchers talk about programming consciousness, are they talking about replicating the function or replicating the structure? Because those may require entirely different approaches. Replicating the function means building a system that does what consciousness does, models futures, generates experience, updates internal representations. Replicating the structure means building something that looks like a brain. The history of engineering suggests that function and structure can sometimes be separated. But with consciousness, we do not yet know which one produces the phenomenon. We do not know whether the experience comes from the function or from something about the specific material running it. That is not a small uncertainty. It is the central one, and it does not have an institutional home. It sits at the intersection of neuroscience, philosophy, evolutionary biology, and computer science, which in practice means it belongs fully to none of them. Building a system that processes patterns is not the same thing as building a system that models possible futures and experiences, being the entity doing the modeling, and that distinction may be the entire difference between artificial intelligence and artificial consciousness. The researchers who study what can be done to human consciousness publish their findings. They write careful papers, they hedge their conclusions, they note the limitations of their methods and call for further investigation, and then the further investigation does not happen. That pattern repeats across neuroscience, AI safety, philosophy of mind, and social media research, and at some point the pattern stops being a coincidence and starts being a signal worth reading carefully. This is not conspiracy. Conspiracy requires coordination, and what is happening here requires none. It requires only that the professional cost of saying the uncomfortable thing clearly is higher than the professional cost of saying nothing, and that this asymmetry is distributed evenly enough across institutions that the silence looks organic. Because it is organic. Nobody decided to suppress the question. The question just keeps running into a structure where following it seriously is expensive and leaving it alone is not. Look at what happened to psychedelic consciousness research. These are scientists studying molecules that can, in controlled conditions, dissolve the boundary between self and world, reconfigure time perception, and produce states that subjects consistently describe as more meaningful than ordinary waking experience. The neural mechanisms behind those shifts are beginning to be mapped. The therapeutic implications are significant, and the field spent roughly 4 decades in a state of institutional exile, fighting for credibility that other areas of neuroscience did not have to fight for at all, because at some point the question of what psychedelics reveal about consciousness became professionally toxic and stayed that way long after the original political reasons for that toxicity at FA dead. The research is recovering now, slowly, but the decades of suppressed investigation are gone. That work was not done. The gap in the literature is real. The AI consciousness researchers face a different version of the same structure. When a serious researcher takes the question of machine consciousness seriously, the default response from the field is not engagement, it is dismissal. The word anthropomorphizing gets deployed fast, as though attributing the possibility of experience to a sufficiently complex information processing system is obviously a category error rather than an open empirical question. The researchers who published the 2025 paper proposing systematic indicators for AI consciousness, drawing on Yoshua Bengio and David Chalmers among others, did careful, credentialed work. The response from most of the field was to note the paper and continue operating as though the question had already been settled in the negative. It has not been settled. The honest answer is that nobody knows how to tell, which is a very different answer, and the refusal to sit with that uncertainty is not scientific rigor. It is institutional comfort dressed up as rigor. The developmental psychology findings are the most immediate case. Researchers studying how algorithmic content systems reshape developing consciousness in children have been producing findings for years. The mechanisms are not obscure: variable reward schedules conditioning attention, emotional activation driving engagement metrics, information environments filtered to maximize time on platform in ways that differ systematically by age, by prior behavior, by what the algorithm has already learned produces the strongest response. The findings get published, they get covered, legislators acknowledge them in hearings, and then the policy response is either absent or so narrow and delayed that it bears no meaningful relationship to the scale of what the research is describing. Millions of DEVA, eloping brains inside an optimization system running without meaningful constraint, and the institutional response is to form another working group. What does that silence cost? That is the question that does not get asked clearly enough. When the psychedelic consciousness research was suppressed for decades, the cost was scientific knowledge that was not accumulated and clinical applications that did not reach patients who needed them. When AI consciousness research gets dismissed as anthropomorphism, the cost is a framework for evaluating a technology that is already deployed at scale without one. When developmental psychology findings about algorithmic effects on children get acknowledged and then set aside, the cost is the continued exposure of populations who cannot evaluate or consent to what is being done to their developing consciousness. These are not abstract costs. They accumulate in real people. The question of whether consciousness can be programmed is not being treated with the urgency the data suggests it deserves, and the reason is not ignorance. The researchers know what the data shows. The reason is that the professional structure of science rewards staying inside the boundaries of what the field is prepared to take seriously, and consciousness, in all its uncomfortable implications, keeps pushing against those boundaries in ways that make institutions nervous. A scientist who asks whether social media companies are running an uncontrolled experiment on human consciousness at planetary scale is making a claim with implications that go well beyond the next grant cycle. A scientist who asks whether AI systems might already meet some minimal threshold for conscious experience is stepping into a question that makes the entire AI industry uncomfortable. The safer move in both cases is to note the evidence, qualify the conclusion, and move on. The evidence gets noted, the question gets filed, and the work that would actually answer it does not get funded. That is not science being careful. That is science being comfortable, and the difference matters considerably when the question has this many implications for this many people. You are living inside the experiment right now, not as a metaphor, as a description of your actual situation at this moment. The information environment you move through every day has been shaped by systems optimized to activate your emotions, hold your attention, return you to the feed. The beliefs you hold about politics, identity, risk. Other people were largely assembled in childhood, before your critical faculties existed in any meaningful form. The automatic responses that govern the majority of your daily behavior were written by conditioning processes you mostly cannot remember and were never asked to consent to. None of that is speculation. It is what the published research across developmental psychology, behavioral science, and neuroscience consistently shows. Here is what makes this hard to sit with. Nobody planned it this way. There is no central authority that designed your childhood conditioning, calibrated your emotional defaults, then handed the remainder of the job to an algorithm. What there is instead is a structural outcome, a set of incentives, economic, professional, social, that nobody deliberately chose but that everyone is participating in and reinforcing. Parents pass on worldviews they themselves received before they had the tools to evaluate them. Platforms optimize for engagement because engagement is what the business model requires. Institutions avoid uncomfortable conclusions because the professional cost of saying the uncomfortable thing clearly is higher than the cost of staying quiet. Nobody is the villain, the structu, reproduces the outcome without needing one. That does not make the outcome less significant. When 95% of your daily behavior runs on automatic programs you did not consciously write, the remaining 5% is operating through a worldview that was installed before you were capable of examining it. The question of how much of your conscious life is genuinely yours is not a comfortable one. Most people do not ask it. The automatic response to that question, if you have spent enough time inside systems that benefit from you not asking it, is to feel that the question itself is absurd, paranoid, or simply not applicable to you specifically, that feeling is also a program. The resistance to examination is one of the most reliable features of a well-installed worldview. If the operating system can produce the experience of freely chosen belief while executing conditioned outputs, it does not need any other protection. What conscious awareness actually offers here is limited but real. The ability to observe an automatic response before acting on it. To pause between the stimulus and the reaction is not a complete solution to anything described in this video. It does not undo childhood conditioning. It does not make algorithmic influence stop running. It does not resolve the hard problem of consciousness or tell you with certainty which of your beliefs you actually chose. What it does is make the gap visible, the gap between the trigger and the response, between the emotion that arrives and the action it is trying to produce. In that gap, something like genuine deliberation becomes possible. The question of who benefits from a particular emotional trigger being so reliably activated is one of the most useful questions available to a person who wants to begin examining their own programming. Outrage is the most optimized emotional state in algorithmic systems right now because it produces the highest and most sustained engagement. If you find yourself outraged, the useful question is not whether the object of your outrage deserves it. It is who profits from your outrage existing at the intensity it does and what behavior that outrage is designed to produce. That is not a call for detachment or passivity. It is a call for one additional step between the emotion and the action, one layer of examination between the conditioned response and the choice you are about to make in its name. The institutions that should be governing these systems are not moving at the pace the data suggests they should. The researchers who document what algorithmic conditioning does to developing consciousness in children produce findings that receive acknowledgement and policy non-response. The companies running the largest behavior modification systems in human history operate largely outside meaningful regulatory engagement with what their systems actually do to the people inside them. The gap between what the science shows and what the institutions have decided to act on has been noted, published, discussed in footnotes, and left open. This is the environment you're operating in. You did not choose the conditions. You did not select the worldview installed before your critical thinking existed. You did not design the reinforcement schedule the platform runs on your attention. But you are here now with whatever degree of conscious awareness you currently have access to, in an environment that is actively working to keep that awareness from being the thing that drives your behavior. The programming is only invisible when you have decided, for whatever reason, that looking at it costs more than not looking.